Alright guys, Murph's here. And today I want to talk about the 7.62 by 5.4 rimmed. I want to talk about a little bit of history as well as compare it to some other cartridges that it often gets compared to. We might be putting a couple of assertions to rest here today, but we'll see. I want you guys to keep in mind that these are my opinions, but there's also some data to back it up. So I'll lay it out as we go. Now, something else to throw out in general for this overall conversation is that you're going to notice that I'm going to talk a lot about specific 7.62 by 5.4 chambered rifles in this discussion, and I'm not going to do the same for other calibers that come up. And that is because there are a finite number of firearms models in general that were ever imported into the United States chambered in 7.62 by 5.4. It's a pretty short list. Whereas if you look at the list for these other very common American sporting cartridges that I'm going to talk about, there's a ton of different rifles chambered for them. So it's a lot easier and also a lot more to the point on some of the realities of this discussion to talk about those specific rifles as opposed to try to talk about each individual sporting rifle chambered in these other cartridges. So with that, let's go ahead and get into a little bit of history. Well, in 1891, Russia unveiled its new Mosin Nagant 1891 long rifle, chambered in 7.62 by 5.4, Russia's new small-bore smokeless powder cartridge. Now this had a 210 grain bullet moving at 2,200 feet per second, mounted into a necked and rimmed cartridge. Now, 2,200 feet per second in a modern smokeless powder cartridge is really not that interesting. However, that's okay because not too long after this, the Germans would develop lightweight Spitzer or pointed bullets. And then every military had to have this type of bullet after that, and Russia was no different from anyone else. They came up with a 150 grain Spitzer type bullet, now moving at 2,800 feet per second. That's more what I'm talking about. That's what I want to hear. Now, it's quite often for American shooters to refer to the Mosin Nagant and the 7.62 by 5.4 specifically as the Russian 30-06, and we're going to put that to test today. Now, before we get too much further in this, let's go ahead and compare the sizes so that anyone who hasn't seen a 7.62 by 5.4 has a better understanding of how it compares to other cartridges. So, on the left is a 7.62 by 3.9. In the center is a 7.62 by 5.4. And to the right is the 30-06, or 7.62 by 63. Now, the American 30-06, in its present form, was developed in 1906. It was an updated version of the 30-03, which, as I understand, there's some slight dimensional differences between the two cartridges, but then the bullet between them is different. The 30-06 originally mounted a 150 grain Spitzer bullet. Now, this bullet was moving at 2,900 feet per second, maybe a little more. And right now, that looks extremely comparable. You could see why someone would make this assertion as the 7.62 by 5.4 being a Russian 30-06. However, we need to put a little bit more context into this conversation right now because these two velocities are not nearly as comparable as you might think. And this is the important thing about data. We can't just look at numbers. We have to look at other context that generated these numbers. So in this case, that 2,800 feet per second, the 7.62 by 5.4, was fired through a long rifle, a 27-inch barreled rifle, whereas the 30-06 was fired out of a 22-inch barrel. So now we need to go ahead and adjust barrel lengths to be a little bit more comparable, and that has us looking at the M38 and M44 Mosin Nagant carbines with 20-inch barrels. And if you run that same 150 grain loading through the 20-inch barrel, you wind up with a 2,600 feet per second rating. Well, that's a lot more different than it was before. That's quite a wide variance, and those 2 additional inches to the 30-06 are not going to account for that much more difference. Trying to pull up data for the 20-inch barrels, not really going to help us in this case. It's not something that I did. It's not really going to improve the overall outcome, especially when you consider that that velocity is only going to go down with additional weight and other bullets that are available in the 7.62 by 5.4. Now, on the subject of bullet availability, the 30-06 has a ton of different offerings available for it, ranging from 100 grains to 220 grains and covering FMJ, match loads, soft points and polymer tips. It's got everything that you could possibly want for it, and velocities exceeding 3,400 feet per second in manufactured loads, let alone hand loads. Whereas the 7.62x5.4 ranges from 147 to 203 grain bullets. It does have soft points, and at one point PPU was bringing in a hollow point boat tail. However, you can't really find soft points in the lighter range of the ammunition and anything pretty much below 174 grain, and there are no polymer tips available that I'm aware of. I still haven't been able to find anything in 150 grain soft point. I hear that they exist, but I've yet to find them. And that's something that really hurts the 7.62x5.4 right off the bat, in addition to the fact that it never really exceeds 2,800 feet per second in manufactured ammunition. Now, I think a lot of this claim comes back to A, not having full context for the data that was drawn between these two cartridges, but also at one point you could pick up Mosin Nagants for around $100. And the ammunition, especially if it was a lot of the military surplus, was coming in for single-digit amounts. Like, I remember picking up some 7.62x5.4 armor piercing for like $4 a box. Well, steel core, armor piercing, steel core, for about $4 a box. And seeing some pretty premium, well-designed or more upper-class soft point bullets going for around 14. That was 10 years ago. Now, 14 is where a lot of your full metal jacket rounds start at, and that's Tula. And if you're actually looking at a soft point ammunition, it's closer to $20. Definitely closer to $20 than it is to 14. So that dynamic has drastically shifted, especially when you look at rifles. What was $100 in a Mosin Nagant is now looking closer to upwards of $350. And at that point, it's actually more cost-effective and in the end state cheaper to get a modern, budget-minded hunting rifle like a Ruger American or any of the other offerings along that same line that is ready for a scope. If you want to do that same thing with a Mosin Nagant, you have to go and sporterize it and actually be able to mount a scope on it and all that kind of stuff. Now, a lot of guys used to like keeping Mosin Nagants around because they didn't pay very much for them. They could beat the hell out of them and not be worried about it. But you can do that same thing with the modern budget rifles, and they'll stand up to it better. Now, 30-06 is still more expensive, but your overall startup cost for getting into it, especially when you start talking about scopes, is a lot easier with the budget-minded rifles that are out on the market. So between velocity and then cost of the rifle, it's looking like the 30-06 is pretty well beaten 7.62x5.4 rather handily. However, all's not lost in this regard. TFB TV did an article a couple years ago comparing 7.62x5.4 to 308 or 7.62x5.1. And I'll actually roll the charts here. It's surprising to see how close the two cartridges actually are. Now, they're not exactly one-for-one swaps, but when you look at velocity, energy, drop, and drift, they actually perform quite close to one another. And it shouldn't be too surprising for a couple of reasons. One, they're not that different in dimension, though 308 consistently performs a little bit better in each one of these facets than 7.62x5.4 does. 7.62x5.4 is right there with it. Now, in addition to that, these two cartridges, at least in a military sense, are actually employed in a lot of the same ways. They are both used in designated marksman's rifles as well as machine guns. So it would make a lot of sense that they would perform in a very similar ballistic capability. And these charts definitely represent that. I'll throw the link in the description to the actual TFB TV website so you guys can actually check out this data a little bit more and get a little bit more depth and context to it. But I was quite surprised at how closely they paralleled one another. And it really makes a lot of sense. Now, extrapolating from there, if I'm considering both cartridges for a hunting type use, I would put them both in a very similar category, but with one caveat, and that would be that if I considered something to be marginal for 308, then I would consider it unacceptable for 7.62x5.4. That's how I'd work that out, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, again, I have way more ammunition offerings available in 308 for a wide variety of bullets and much better research put in those bullets. because when we use a lot of the soft point ammunition for 7.62 by 5.4 for hunting purposes, especially on some of the larger game, it's been found that the terminal ballistics are not actually that great. A lot of that soft point ammunition winds up stripping off its metal jacket and more or less ice picking, not fully mushrooming its soft lead core. So a lot of that stuff was not working out as was intended. So I would drop off 7.62 by 5.4 before I would drop off 308 for consideration for heavier game hunting. Now, when it comes to, I guess you could say, the 7.62 by 5.4 legacy, there's actually quite a bit to talk about there. In general, the 7.62 by 5.4 is one of the longest serving, if not the longest serving, military cartridges in the world. The 303 British might be hanging on, but there's a couple of caveats that are associated with that. And that is that if anyone's still using 303 British, it's in the former or current Commonwealth armies, and they're probably in the form of like Vickers machine guns or something like that, which no new Vickers machine guns have been produced in quite a few years, and Vickers machine guns were most definitely built to last. Whereas PKM machine guns shavered in 7.62 by 5.4 are still rolling hot off the presses. Pun intended. That was a stamped receiver joke in case it went over somebody's head. In addition to that, 7.62 by 5.4 is one of the few successful rimmed cartridges still on the market. The vast majority of rimmed cartridges drop out shortly after World War II, if they even made it that far. And the only other rimmed bottlenecked cartridge, mind you, that keeps pace with the 7.62 by 5.4 would probably be the 30-30 Winchester. I would say those two would be fairly comparable in overall popularity and availability. But things like 8mm Lebel, that dropped out a long time ago, and it was the first and foremost in this category, and it was also the first to go away. Well, guys, I hope you found this overall conversation enlightening, and that's pretty much what I got. So, have a good day.